This conversation is part of an interview project through the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. We're speaking with Yale alumni in order to more deeply understand the hearts and minds of those who work at the intersection of spiritual leadership and environmental action. Today, we are grateful to be joined by Dr. Russell Powell. Russell is research affiliate and research and program specialist for the Thinking with Plants and Fungi Research Initiative at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. His research focuses on the religious, ethical, and political resonances of contemporary environmental issues, particularly the religious dimension of American environmental thought. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk.
So yeah, I'd love if you, to start, can kind of take us to the beginning and tell us a little bit about how this interest and this intersection sort of got sparked for you.
Sure. And I should say it's a real privilege to speak with the Forum on Religion and Ecology. It's a gathering of scholars and practitioners that I've benefited immensely from, going all the way back to my own student days at the Yale Divinity School, and have really learned a lot from over the years. So the chance to contribute to the conversations that the Forum is hosting is always going to be an opportunity I leap at. In terms of the beginning and how my interest in this, the intersection of these questions related to the relationship of religion and ecology sort of got off the ground. I grew up in rural North Carolina in the Christian church, surrounded by landscapes that, even if I didn't have the language for it at the time, really sort of shaped my sense of what was sacred. My father's side of the family comes from a Scotch Presbyterian background, and I was drawn to the theological structure and moral clarity that I found in that tradition when I was growing up. I even considered, and for a time pursued, a formal theological training, eventually discerned that wasn't for me. When I went to the Yale Divinity School for my master's, though, my focus settled on the Reformed theological tradition, especially the work of Jonathan Edwards, the 18th century American preacher and theologian. And what fascinated me so much about Edwards was his ability to articulate a vision of divine presence that was so deeply embedded in the natural world. This was really striking to me, and his view that nature itself was charged with meaning, that it wasn't just a backdrop for human existence, but an expression of something greater. But my real entry point into religion and ecology, at least as I conceive of my place in the field now, came during my doctoral work at Princeton Seminary, and that was when I began reading the Transcendentalists more seriously, namely Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. And I did that under the influence of my teacher at the time, Jeffrey Stout at Princeton University. And what I found in someone like Emerson was an attempt to reimagine religious experience outside of doctrinal structures. But he did this in a way that held on to a deep sense of moral and spiritual engagement with the world. So, Emerson's writing alongside Thoreau's and others in the Transcendentalists literary movement of the 19th century led me to see how the questions that had always animated me, these questions about, what is the good life and how we recognize and respond appropriately to value beyond ourselves, beyond the boundaries of our own minds. These were, I began to see, also at the heart of American environmental thought. That realization opened up a much broader landscape for my learning. I began to see that the kinds of ethical and theological questions that I was wrestling with in the Reformed theological tradition, these questions of transcendence and responsibility, moral obligation, these were also being worked out in the American environmental literary canon, right? The difference was that American nature writers were framing their questions in terms of humanity's relationship to the more than human world. So my dissertation focused on John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, sort of 19th century, nature mystic and adventurer, and it focused namely on his relationship to Emerson and how that relationship shaped Muir's moral vocabulary around wilderness preservation. So what I came to see in that work was that religion isn't something that has to be discarded or overcome. in order to develop a satisfactory environmental ethic. I think too often religion is treated as preventing environmental consciousness from emerging in its full bloom. Religious traditions instead provide, I learned in my, or really sort of focused on in my dissertation, the ways in which religious traditions provide the moral vocabularies in which we reason through our relationship with the world. Muir didn't abandon the religious language of his upbringing. He reworked it. He translated it. He found new ways to express his ethical commitments through it. And that insight has really been foundational for me. It reinforced for me the idea that religious vocabularies they're not these fixed things that perhaps need to be gotten rid of because they're preventing something new from coming into existence when it comes to our environmental consciousness. Religious vocabularies change and evolve, and they often can evolve in ways that deepen our responsiveness to the ecological crises that we're now facing. So those are the sort of inquiries that brought me to this work.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I mean, I'd be really curious kind of to go towards that sort of where you just ended of like the ways in which religious vocabularies change over time and how they've influenced or kind of show up in American environmentalism over time. So could you kind of like shed light on some of those threads, places where you see that that kind of crossing over or influencing kind of most alive? Yeah.
I think the example that I was giving, or that's coming to mind, is the example I was giving earlier, and it's the one that sort of brought my own inquiries to life around these questions. And it's the ways in which a number of really important and critical figures within the what I'm generally calling the American environmental literary canon, emerged from this tradition, the Reformed theological tradition, that has its basis in sort of Calvinist Protestantism. I've mentioned John Muir, but figures, another figure like that comes to mind is someone like Rachel Carson, who also herself was raised Presbyterian with this moral vocabulary grounded in the Reformed tradition. And this tradition has a special emphasis on a transcendent and all-powerful other, traditionally conceived of as God, but in many ways, especially in Calvin's writing, you find nature, the more than human, sort of taking on the contours and the shapes of this other as an all-powerful sort of condition that grounds our being, right? It's that sort of language and that sort of emphasis on an all-powerful other that grounds the affective modes that we find operative within the American environmental literary canon, like this sense of wonder, for instance, that someone like Muir and obviously someone like Carson are so often operationalizing in their writing. They're saying what makes the more than human world valuable. They're saying, well, for many reasons, one important one being because it elicits such wonder within the human response to it. That's a religious affection, to use the language of Jonathan Edwards, going back to the 18th century. That is sort of steeped and prioritized within the Reformed theological tradition. So the ways in which that kind of vocabulary, that affective dimension, gets taken up at different points in history and operationalized in the ways that the historical context calls for is just one way in which religious vocabularies are being employed at different ways and at different points in the human nature relationship.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, kind of, how do you see that sort of in the current, or in the just sort of more recently, let's say in the last decade of the environmental movement, and as sort of relationship to organized religion is changing in this country, kind of how that influence and exchange of language, affect, conception, this relationship to this greater force, other, sort of shifting? I'm curious.
I think a couple things are springing to mind. One is the sort of prophetic element of the American environmental movement.
Mm-hmm.
This is another sort of robust dimension of the Reformed theological tradition. This emphasis on, in many ways, it can be a sort of an emphasis on a really sort of exacting spirit of moral judgment. Right, we need to get into right relationship when it comes to the moral dimension of our relationship with the natural world. You see that being enacted in environmental organizations, from the largest NGOs to the smallest sort of local organizations at work on clean water protection or concerns around species loss, these sorts of things. So the prophetic dimension of religious tradition, drawing on the language of moral censure. This has obviously been a really big part of the American environmental movement, and I think has, and plenty of other scholars have written on this too, has sort of deep deep religious roots.
Mm-hmm.
The other way is the ways in which I'll return to this emphasis on wonder, and something like the Reformed theological tradition has opened up new pathways for thinking about alternative forms of intelligence, right? So you see this emerging in say critical plant studies, this turn within the last couple decades to imagine something like intelligence, something like consciousness, as being something that is the province inhabited by beings that are the more than human, right? What does it mean for our concepts of intelligence to change when we recognize the capacities of plants to learn, to remember, to communicate? I think in a lot of ways, the religious impulse to wonder at the mystery of the creation, I think that motivates a lot of these inquiries into just how poorly we currently understand the nature of consciousness, not only how it's expressed in humanity, but how it's expressed all around us.
Yeah. Oh. I have so many questions on this, but I do want to take us kind of towards another emphasis of your work on kind of race and racism in relation to the environmental movement and environmental racism and ecological consciousness, and how, can you just kind of tell us a little bit about how, about the intersection in your work and in the world between race and ecological consciousness and over time? Yeah. Well,
race and racism are of course deeply embedded in the history of American environmental thought, right? So the mainstream environmental movement has often been dominated by white voices and the concerns that tend to get the most attention when articulated by those voices, right? Like wilderness preservation, for instance. Right. And those concerns historically have overlooked the realities of environmental racism. So communities of color are being disproportionately exposed to pollution, toxic waste, the effects of climate change, etc. And their struggles with those effects being sidelined in environmental discourse. This has been a problem since the mainstream environmental movement got off the ground in the late 19th century. Principally with the efforts of a figure like John Muir. So my work is to examine also the religious dimensions of these types of exclusions. So the history of settler colonialism in the U.S., for instance, wasn't just a political or economic project. It was a religious one, right? Christian missionaries played a major role in dispossessing indigenous peoples of their lands, often justifying it through theological arguments that cast the land as empty or unclaimed or in need of cultivation, right? Similarly, the transatlantic slave trade violently separated African peoples from their lands and their spiritual traditions, and forced them into a relationship with the American landscape that was defined by labor and subjugation rather than freedom or belonging. And the ways in which religious reasoning to support these sorts of practices, these sort of economic practices, and this sort of cultural and economic forms of subjugation were given religious reasons. So if we want to center racial justice in our religious and environmental work, which I think we should want to do, I think we have to start by acknowledging these histories. A lot of my work is focused on the ways in which American environmentalism in its current present-day iteration can do that acknowledgement work. It's work that gets done by recognizing that American environmentalism is a living tradition that has participated in these modes of domination, precisely so that coming to a self-conscious awareness of that participation can sort of lead a path forward for not participating in that domination any longer, right? But beyond that acknowledgement, I think we also need to actively amplify the ecological thought and spiritual traditions of communities that have been historically excluded. So indigenous knowledge systems, for instance, which contain ways of relating to the land that don't separate the religious from the ecological, or Black environmental thinkers since the emergence of especially the environmental justice movement, that draw attention to the ways in which racial justice and environmental justice concerns are inseparable. I think along these lines, religious communities have a really important opportunity, I want to say, a responsibility to listen to these traditions, to take them seriously, and to recognize them as essential to any meaningful environmental movement. So for me, as someone who comes at this through the lens of my sort of commitment to rehabilitating American environmentalism as a living tradition that should not be engaged in the sort of methods and means of domination that it's participated in the past, as well as my work as a pragmatist. I come at this through the avenue of the question of language and its bearing on these considerations. The words we use shape whose voices are heard and whose get ignored. So if environmentalism continues to be framed in a way that centers only certain kinds of experiences, if it assumes, for instance, that environmental concern is primarily about protecting pristine wilderness, then it's going to leave out many of the communities for whom environmental harm is not a sort of abstract issue, but an immediate and lived reality, right? So expanding the conversation means expanding the ways that we listen, both to people and to their histories, but also to the land itself, to the more than human.
I was kind of curious in the kind of rehabilitation of the American environmental movement towards centering racial justice and the voices that have been historically excluded from that movement. What, if any, do you see as the particular role of religious traditions, religious communities, spiritual traditions in that rehabilitation?
Okay. Well, it's a great question, and I think it hits on some of the work that I feel like is most pressing for scholars within religion and ecology, and how they're examining what's taking place in religious communities as these questions are being asked. So, a critical question, not just for religious communities, but the scholars of religion and ecology who are studying them, is how we're engaging questions related to race, colonialism, histories of dispossession, right? Religion and ecology has often focused on retrieving ecological wisdom from religious traditions, but it's not always, I think, interrogated the ways that those same traditions have been implicated in environmental harm, right? So there's growing recognition that colonial and racial histories aren't sort of peripheral to religion and ecology. They're central to it, right? So how we engage these histories moving forward is going to shape the ethical and intellectual integrity of the field. And I think we're coming into an awareness of the ways in which religious traditions, as living traditions, are require to take these questions seriously, to develop the sort of moral competency of their traditions, to be able to engage with their historical participation in something like colonialism, to amend that going forward.
Yeah, that's such important and powerful work. Yeah. So you're kind of exploring these questions in a really interesting context, which is an academic context. And I'm curious kind of what it's like to be working on these kinds of questions, which in a way all really are about, they all really touch on such deep existential and emotional and interpersonal and relational, questions. And as well as kind of in your work around, intelligence and consciousness among plants and fungi and in the non-human world more generally, and our sense of the sacred and the relationship to the sacred. So I'm just kind of curious to hear a little bit about what exploring these questions that you've laid out so powerfully in the academic context in which you're working in, what that's like, what the challenges and opportunities of that are.
I'll speak about the challenges. I'll begin with the challenges, and maybe that will illumine as I go along some of the possibilities that come with doing this sort of work in an academic context. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is that sort of environmental destruction is often framed as a crisis of science or policy or technology, whether the failures of those things or otherwise the ways in which those things can sort of light a path beyond the crises that we find ourselves in. While those are, of course, sort of critical dimensions, they're also not the whole picture, right? The way we relate to the earth is shaped by deeper cultural structures of meaning, of ethics, of imagination even. So I think this is where religious and spiritual communities have an enormous role to play, and it's part of what makes studying them within the field of religion and ecology, within a scholarly fold, such an exciting place to be. Because if those communities are going to be part of the solution to acknowledging and responding appropriately to the environmental crises that we're faced with today, they also have to be willing to critically examine their own histories and their own sort of traditional ways of being. So a challenge I see is that many religious communities are still hesitant to fully sort of embrace ecological responsibility as a central concern, right? There's often a sense that environmentalism is a secular issue, or that something like climate change is something external to religious life, rather than something that fundamentally reshapes what it means to be religious in the first place. I think this is a big part of what my work seeks to do. It sort of challenges this idea that the sphere of environmental concern is primarily a sphere of the secular. So moving forward, I think one of the key tasks will be helping religious communities to see that ecological care is not simply an add-on to their work, right? It's already embedded in their traditions, whether that's been recognized or not. And moreover, religious traditions are always changing to respond to their practical circumstances, to the circumstances in which these traditions are practiced, right? So how are those changes already taking place? I think that's a really important insight that the scholar of religion and ecology can provide us with today, and maybe needs to be our focus as we grapple more so with the state we find ourselves in of ecological crisis or multiple crises. But at the same time, I think we have an additional opportunity insofar as the climate crisis specifically is forcing people to ask fundamental questions about meaning, responsibility, the nature of human existence. And many people are looking for frameworks that go beyond mere policy debates or personal lifestyle changes. They're looking for something that can make sense of the scale that we're facing, of the scale of the crisis we're facing, I should say, to provide a way to respond with integrity. And I think religious and philosophical traditions have obviously long been grappling with questions of impermanence or suffering, obviously with moral obligation. So this remains a moment when those traditions can step forward, not necessarily with easy answers, there are none, but with a sort of depth of thought, a depth of practice, and a deep well of moral resources that have been cultivated over centuries as living traditions, to give the people who are asking these questions the tools to apply in their interrogations, to figure out, what next steps can I take to contribute within both my religious community and at the level of an individual as a citizen, to being part of solutions. So for me, the opportunity lies in the fact that we're not just talking about the future of religion and ecology as a field. We're talking about the future of how we think and speak and act in relationship to the earth itself, right? If we take seriously the idea that language shapes reality, as I do, then I think we have to consider how religious and spiritual traditions, as well as philosophical traditions, can help us develop new ways of speaking and thinking about the natural world. Not just in the sense of finding the right theological terms, but in the sense of creating a different kind of attentiveness, one that moves beyond this sort of modalities of control and extraction and toward response and participation. I think that's so much of what informs a lot of the scholarship that's taking place in religion and ecology today. So if there's a way forward, I think it will require more than just expanding the reach of the scholarship that's occurring in religion and ecology today. It's going to require a transformation in how we conceive of knowledge and ethics and responsibility. It's going to require listening in ways that we haven't listened before, really to those who have been excluded, to those who have resisted dominant narratives, and perhaps even to the land itself, to the non-human. It's that, I think, that is both the challenge and the opportunity before us.
That's such a powerful, beacon, North Star, and something to look towards and work towards. It's really, there's so much in there, and just, So as we move towards kind of the end of our time, I sort of just wanted to ask you if there are places that we didn't get to go in this conversation that you would like to go. There's so many threads that I would love to follow up on, but I want to also just give you the chance to kind of think about where we've been and where we haven't been.
Well, I've tried to gear my responses mainly to the ways in which I see the considerations around the cultivation of environmental consciousness sort of being expressed and explored within something like the field of religion and ecology. I'd be happy to speak more to some of the foci of my work, but if where I concluded on the previous beat was a good stopping place, I don't want to necessarily double back to touch more on my own individual focus. So I'm happy leaving it there if that's the best place.
Okay. All right. I mean, maybe when we pause the recording, I can ask a little bit more about that. But we're trying to, keep things a little bit tight for the videos.
Sure.
So maybe we'll pause here.
That's great.
So thank you so much for sharing so thoughtfully and offering so many just really rich questions and areas of exploration and reflection, self-reflection, communal reflection, historical reflection. So I'm really, really appreciative of the opportunity to learn from you. And so thank you.
Great. Thanks for the chance to share. And like I said, always excited to learn from and participate in the learning that's going on at the forum. So thank you for the opportunity.